Well, once again, I'm delighted to be able to talking to you in Malaysia and that. Tonight I want to talk about an aspect of Buddhism which I don't think gets much attention, and that is the Buddha not as a philosopher, not as an Indian, not as somebody who lived many centuries ago, but simply the Buddha as a human being. But before we can talk about that, we have to answer the question whether or not he was a human being did the Buddha exist? Now that's an easy question to answer, but one would have to admit that there is actually no material evidence for the existence of the Buddha. Don't get too worried. There is no material evidence for the existence of Jesus either. But I think almost all scholars, with one or two exceptions, accept that Jesus was a real person. Now, of course, that doesn't mean he was God or anything like that, but that there was such a person called Jesus of Nazareth is almost certain. Likewise, even though there is no direct material evidence for the existence of the Buddha, to the best of my knowledge, the overwhelming majority of scholars accept that there was a person called Gautama Buddha, or Siddhartha Gautama. And in the case of Jesus, it is perhaps unusual or curious that there is no material evidence for him, because there is so much material evidence from that time, the 1st century AD. We have Roman inscriptions and Aramaic inscriptions and Greek inscriptions. We have all sorts of artifacts, even some manuscripts, but none of them point to the presence of somebody called Jesus. In the case of the Buddha, it's somewhat different because he lived 500 years before Jesus. That's a long time, nearly half a millennium. And he lived in a culture, in a country or in an area in India which had an entirely different climate to Palestine or Israel. There in Palestine, Israel, it's very hot, but it's also very dry. So wood, timber, paper even can survive for thousands of years. Whereas in the Ganges Valley, what is now the Indian state of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, it's hot, but it's wet also. And as a result of that, it's a subtropical climate. And as a result of that, you've got things like white ants or termites and all sorts of insects that are likely to eat anything that is edible. So, and the second thing, of course, is there was no writing in northern India at the time of the Buddha. So, to the best of our knowledge, Indian culture in northern India in the 5th century BC was primarily a wooden culture. There was vast areas of forest, and therefore most buildings, houses, structures, and that were made of wood. And in a climate like the North Indian climate, it simply wouldn't last very long. We have copies of the Bible going back to, or only fragments, but fragments of the Bible written on papyrus, going back to maybe 150, 200 years after Jesus. Not a complete Bible, but fragments, but nothing even remotely like that can be found in India, because in that climate, it simply wouldn't survive. And as a result of that, not only do we have no material evidence for the existence of the Buddha, we don't have much material evidence for anything. It's not until much later, the time of King Asoka, when we get the first writing. And interestingly enough, the oldest decipherable writing in India, that is the inscriptions of King Asoka, happen to mention the Buddha. But there are other reasons for thinking that the Buddha existed, that he was a real person, and that is his teachings. The Dhamma is a broad and highly sophisticated philosophy. And if the Buddha didn't exist, somebody had to present all of these ideas. So, and there is so much of it, we would expect it to have been fabricated by a group of people. And yet it is so consistent. So the mere fact that we have a large body of teachings, that it is highly sophisticated and complex, and that it's also consistent, internally consistent, suggests the mind of one person. So that in itself is strong indirect evidence for the existence of the Buddha. So, as a consequence of that, almost all Indologists, historians of Indian culture, accept that the Buddha was a real person. So the next thing we have to look at is, was the Buddha a human being? Well, this is an unnecessarily controversial subject. And there is a group of people who say that, no, the Buddha was not a human being. We don't know what he was, but there was no human being called the Buddha. And they quote several discourses from the Tipitaka where supposedly the Buddha is asked, are you a human? And that he denies it. Okay? So if you go to the Anguttara Nikaya, there's a sutta called the Donna Sutta, and it's about a man, a Brahmin, one of the priests in the Brahminical religion. And he's walking along the road, and in the dust, he sees some footprints. And because he was a Brahmin, he was well versed in the art of predicting something about a person by marks on their body. And when he looked at those footprints, he thought, these are definitely the footprints of an unusual person, an auspicious person. So he followed this is what the story says, he followed those footprints and eventually came to the Buddha sitting under a tree, at the foot of a tree, probably resting after a long journey by foot. And he was very taken by how serene and calm the Buddha was. In fact, he probably had a radiant complexion. And so this Brahmin asked him a question, according to some people, are you a god? And the Buddha said, no. Then are you a Gandhabba? Gandhabba is a sort of you might say an angel, a heavenly being that plays instruments. Are you a spirit? Now, the Pali word is yaka, and yaka usually means a malevolent spirit, a goblin, or an ogre. But here it's best translated as spirit, as a spirit being. Again, the Buddha said no. And then he asked, then, are you a human being? And the Buddha said no. Now that sutta is quoted frequently by those uninformed people who insist that the Buddha was not a human being. Now the problem is that this well-known sutra has been mistranslated. So when it first became known in the West, and it's been circulating ever since, the question has always been, are you a god? Are you an angel? Are you a spirit? Are you a human being? To which the Buddha supposedly said no. And they say, you see, he denied that he was a human being. The problem was that this sutta was not properly translated. Rather than the present tense, are you, the Pali is bhavisati, which is, will you become? So the Brahman Donna did not ask the Buddha, are you a god, an angel, a spirit, or a human being? He asked him, will you become, the future tense? Will you become a god, an angel, a spirit, or a human being? In other words, will you be reborn after you die? To which the Buddha answered, no. And at the end of the sutta, he simply says, and why not? Because I am fully enlightened, meaning that I will not be reborn. So when some, like I said, uninformed people use this sutta to supposedly prove that the Buddha wasn't a human, or that he didn't believe that he was a human, they are using the poor translation, the incorrect translation. So what evidence do we have that the Buddha was human? Well, there's quite a lot, actually. I'll give two examples. In the Sutta Nipata, which is one of the earliest stratas of Buddhist literature, Rahula, the Buddha's son, comes up to him and pays his respect to his father. And then he says that he will always honor his father. Lord, I will always honor you as the torchbearer of humanity. Ukkano daro manusana. You are the torchbearer of humanity. Now, the Buddha could only be a torchbearer of humanity if he himself was human. So in this particular sutta, Rahula is referring to his father, the Buddha, as a human being. Then there are at least 7 or 8 places in the Tipitaka where the Buddha is exhorting his disciples, lay disciples, but mainly monks. He's exhorting them, don't give up, keep trying. If you practice as I have taught, you will attain enlightenment, bodhi. You'll become free, complete liberation, the end of suffering, opting out of samsara. And when he says that, he then says that I have done that. I've done it, therefore you can do it. And I have done it through human strength, human exertion, human striving. Purisa tamena, purisa viryena, purisa pakakamena. I have done it through human strength, human exertion, human striving. What does he mean by that? Well, I have exerted those faculties that I have as a human being. So there he is, very clearly calling himself a human being and saying that the energy or the faculties that we have as human beings, myself included, that is the Buddha saying myself included, it is possible to attain enlightenment. There are other examples of where the Buddha very clearly refers to himself as a human being. So we can say, first of all, that the Buddha existed, and that secondly, he was a human being and he claimed to be a human being. Now, sometimes you hear people say, the Buddha was an ordinary human being, or he was a human being just like us. That I would not agree with. And the Buddha certainly always referred to himself as an exceptional human being, a particular type of human being. And by that he meant that physically, as far as how he behaved, how he felt various feelings, how he was sometimes healthy, how sometimes he became sick, and how eventually his body aged and he passed away. In that sense, he was an ordinary human being. But as far as his realization, the depth and the breadth of his knowledge and his understanding, in that sense, he was spiritually far beyond ordinary humanity. So I think when one says that the Buddha was an ordinary human being, we have to be cautious, and perhaps we have to say that physically he was an ordinary human being. Psychologically, spiritually, what was going on in his head, his perceptions and his understandings, in that sense, he was far beyond humanity. Why is this important? Why is it important that the Buddha should be seen as, and we should see him as, human? Well, if the guide, the spiritual guide you have is a God, divine, then of course you can never become like them. Although there are some religions that say that you can become divine, you can become a divine being also. But certainly that is not the case in Buddhism, and in Islam and Christianity, that is certainly not the case. But when we realize that the Buddha was a human being, but that he became extraordinary, that opens for us the possibility that we could do that too. As we just said, the Buddha said that I did it through human strength, human exertion, human striving. So if he could do it, then we could do it too. And I take that to be a very positive idea. When I look at myself, sometimes you think, well, perhaps I could become enlightened, but I think it's a long way off for me. But then when I think about and recall the Buddha and what he did in that, I think, well, perhaps I could become like him. And that gives me the strength and the determination to do exactly that. So that is a very good thing to know, that we are all in this together. There are some who are far ahead than us, but through their guidance, through their encouragement, and through their help, we could become like them, completely free, just radiant, free, full of compassion, kindness, and concern for others, far beyond the ordinary life that most people live. Now, I have heard some people say, oh, when we have our problems, we can always look to this God or that God to give us the strength to deal with those problems. Whereas you Buddhists, you don't have anybody like that. Well, I don't really agree with that. When the Buddha passed away, he attained a state which is called complete nirvana. When he sat under the Bodhi tree, he attained the first stage of enlightenment, first stage of nirvana. And then when he passed away, he attained what is sometimes called nirvana without residue. Okay, so from the time he attained enlightenment to the time he passed away, he still had a body, and therefore he was heir to all the things that human bodies are heir to. Being tired, getting sick, having to eat because you get hungry, getting knocked, dropping things on your foot, banging into something, all those sorts of things. That was the same for him. But after he passed away, the body dropped away completely and he became totally 100% free, liberated, etc. But then people will say, well, that's it, you're on your own. Buddhism is a do-it-yourself course. Well, maybe. But it seems to me that when you read about the Buddha, that can inspire you, it can give you determination and energy. And we get our guidance not from messages from above, but rather from reading what the Buddha had to say, the advice that he left for us, the inspiration that he transmitted through his words. We have that. And apparently, it seems that throughout history, there have been people who have dealt with sometimes extraordinary difficulties because they were inspired by the Buddha's example. In India today, there's a group of people who are at the bottom rank of the Indian caste system. Not a nice place to be. You're excluded from most activities within society. There's all sorts of prejudices against you, etc. And although that situation is changing to some degree, the majority of such people, low caste people and outcast people, have a very difficult life to live. They've got a long way to be full citizens of their country. And they have to deal with day-to-day discrimination. Interestingly, it is those people who are turning to Buddhism in very large numbers. Quite a few years ago, I was invited to attend a conversion ceremony. And there were about, from one small district, there were about 800 of these people who had decided to leave their religion, Hinduism, and embrace Buddhism. And I talked after this ceremony, I talked to some of these people, and this is exactly what they told me. What had inspired them to hang on, to keep striving, to reach for something and to come to terms with the difficulties they face? And without exception, they all told me it was the example of the Buddha. So just because the Buddha is no longer accessible, it does not mean we do not have his help, his guidance, and his inspiration. So that's important to remember too. Then another reason why I think the Buddha as a human being is important is because of meditation. Now, the Buddha taught a variety of meditation, and I think it can be said that he taught different types of meditation because there are different types of people. And because people are different, they are inevitably going to have different needs. And so he's taught some meditations that are good for this type of person, this type of character, person with these abilities and interests, and other meditations for people who are different. And one of these meditations is called the Anusatis. Anusati means, sati means mindfulness, but in this context, it means to recall, or to remember, or to recollect. So Anusati means to recollect. And these meditations are called the recollections. And the first three are recollecting the Buddha, recollecting the Dhamma, and recollecting the Sangha. Then you have things like recollecting sila, virtue, recollecting, calling to mind, thinking about your virtue, then friendship, then death, generosity, and so on. But in the first of these is called Buddhanusati. And how you do this meditation is you sit quietly in a quiet place. You put yourself in a calm mood, and then you think about the Buddha's qualities. You You can think about an incident when he had great compassion for others. Or you can think about how he struggled to attain enlightenment. How he had the patience to deal with the obstacles that he had to overcome. One of the things about the Buddha I occasionally think of is in the hours before he passed away. You may know the story. So we are told in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta that the Buddha lay down between two saltaries. He was very ill. He was 80 years old. And he'd come to the end of his life. And the people from the nearby town, the mullahs, they all came out of their town to pay their homage, their respects to the Buddha. So there was a large crowd of people gathered around him. And it so happened that in the town, there was a wandering ascetic named Subhadda. And he had never met the Buddha, but he had heard about him. He had heard stories about him. If you ever get the opportunity, meet the Buddha. He is a remarkable person. So here he was. It was in the evening. There was a large crowd of people. He asked, what's the crowd gathered here for? And they said, well, the Buddha is here and he's near the end of his life. So Subhadda sort of made his way through the crowd because he wanted to talk to the Buddha. This was his first opportunity to do this. And Ananda, who was like the Buddha's aide-de-camp, we might say, saw this wandering ascetic coming forward, and he told him, wait. And Subhadda said, I'd really like to talk to the Buddha. And Ananda said, my goodness, man, he's only got a few hours left to live. For goodness sake, leave him alone. And the Buddha noticed this encounter taking place. And he said to Ananda, desist, let him come forward. And so Subhadda came forward, and for a certain period of time, we're not told how long, but maybe half an hour, maybe 3/4 of an hour, maybe an hour, the Buddha and Subhadda had a conversation. Once again, we are not told exactly what happened, but I imagine that Subhadda was asking questions. How do I do this? Or should I do this? And the Buddha was teaching him the Dhamma. Now, I think that is quite a remarkable story. Can you imagine? You've only got a short time left to live. You're tired, you're old, and you're ill. And yet, you still find time to talk to somebody who's interested to know the Dhamma. I think that that is a remarkable story. And sometimes when I'm doing this meditation, Buddhanusati, that's another story I think about. I imagine in my mind what it was like. I try to imagine in my mind, why would the Buddha have done that? Somebody he's never met, who's not even one of his disciples, and yet he takes time off to talk to him. That is a remarkable compassion. And then there are other stories we can think of. There are stories when we are told that the Buddha and Ananda found a monk very sick, lying in his own excrement. And they took the time off to pick this monk up, wash him, and put him in a clean bed. Couldn't have been very pleasant dealing with it, the smell, the feces, the flies, and yet they did it. Once again, out of compassion. So Buddhanusati is the meditation where you take an object from the Buddha's life, from his career, from his actions, and then you simply quietly contemplate them. Some people have told me they do this contemplation by imagining the Buddha's physical form. It seems that in ancient times, artists may have very well done this, and this enabled them to produce some of the greatest works of art. Even people who are not Buddhists, when they see one of these exceptionally beautiful Gandhara Buddha statues, are really moved by it. When I was in Korea some time ago, in the museum there, they have an image of the Buddha sitting with his hand like this, as if he is contemplating or thinking. One of the most beautiful and inspiring images I've ever seen. I've seen pictures of this statue before, but to see the real thing was really very moving. There are some Thai statues of the Buddha which seem to have the ability to make you feel calm just looking at them. How did these artists do this? I suspect very strongly that sometimes they simply did Buddhānussati. They contemplated, imagined what the Buddha would have looked like. And then they turned that imagination into bronze or stone works of great beauty. So I think that's important too. Today, the fashion is mindfulness meditation. That's good. In fact, that's wonderful. But don't let all the talk and the discussion on mindfulness meditation, don't let that make you forget that there are other types of meditation too, and that from time to time it can be good to do those too, which is the very reason why the Buddha taught them and encouraged his disciples to sometimes practice them. So all of this, to me, suggests that knowing the Buddha as a human being is a wonderful opportunity for us to move, behave, think, feel, etc., the way that he did, in the hope that in time, as things unfold naturally, we too will be able to become like the Buddha, that is, fully enlightened. It's a long journey, but as the Taoist sages say, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. Okay, that's all I've got to say for this evening.